The thing that worries me the most is a world in 2 years where there's literally trillions of agents acting on our behalf.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. I'm Dan Kaplan, Director of Content at Ambit. I know we have a huge global audience watching, so allow me to be among the first to say thank you so much for being at NHIcon 2026. As Apoorva just illustrated in his opening remarks, we have quite the event planned for you, and our opening keynote sets the stage for all of it. Phil Venables has spent his career working at the intersection of security, risk, and scale, from serving as the first CISO at Goldman Sachs to later Google Cloud, to today as partner of Ballistic Ventures and a strategic advisor to governments, boards, and some of the world's largest technology platforms. Beyond those stellar credentials, what makes Phil a natural choice to open NHIcon is that he bridges the audience in this room today. He's been accountable for real security outcomes as a CISO, but he also brings a deep technical foundation with formal training in computer science and cryptography to how he evaluates threats and system behavior. And as you'll see today, Phil isn't here to hype AI or dismiss it either. He's focused on separating what's fundamentally changing from what isn't, and what that means for the attacker-defender dynamic, and of course, organizations like yours and the jobs you do. Toward the end of Phil's talk, I'll come back on stage and moderate some Q&A. So get those questions in, please. We want to get to them. Anything we're unable to get to, Phil will stick around and try to answer as well in the chat. Sit back, relax, and enjoy NHIcon 2026. Phil, please take it away.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Big pleasure to be here, especially in this audience. All of you working across some of the most challenging parts of cyber and information security. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you all today. So what I'm going to talk about today is a broad-ranging set of topics around AI, particularly AI for security and the security of AI, but also start to look at what does it mean and what do we think about what comes after what comes next in terms of what's going on. So one of the things I probably don't need to tell you all that AI is disrupting the cybersecurity balance. It's lowering the bar for attackers. We're seeing this already, and I'll talk more about that as we go through this. But it's also, as I think many of you are probably feeling, it's drastically scaling defenders' capabilities as well. And so while we see opportunities for attackers, I still believe that we see even more opportunities for defenders, even though in some places attackers may be a little bit ahead at the moment. But certainly the history of offense versus defense is going to continue and going to continue at a pace that we've probably not seen before. And so it's on all of us as defenders to take advantage of this technology in appropriate ways at the same time of trying to watch how attackers are doing this. But one of the things it's worthwhile before we kind of go much further is just look at kind of what's not new. And so if you look at the past couple of years since the rise of generative AI in particular, it's sometimes when you kind of look at what's being talked about in the industry, it's almost like AI is brand new. And of course, we all know it isn't. Over the past 10, 15 years, many parts of cybersecurity, whether it's anomaly detection or malware detection, spam filtering, all sorts of technology has been inherently dependent on machine learning and deep learning in particular. And so it's not new that we think about AI in cybersecurity. And similarly, the use of AI for attackers is not new either. Attackers have been taking advantage of this technology, albeit not at the scale they're currently doing, but it's certainly the case that AI has been a tool for attackers just in the same way that it has been for defenders. And also when you look at automation, we spend a lot of time looking at AI and agentic AI as a prime source of how we transform the productivity and automation of our business processes, our cybersecurity activities, our organizations. Again, automation is not new. It's been the heart of everything that we've been doing with technology for decades. But what's different now is interesting to just kind of pause on before we start going into some of the detail. And so when we think about this technology of generative AI and the broad array of new AI technologies, there's a lot of sense out there that in some cases it's a little bit overhyped. But what was interesting, a few months ago, I was at a conference of CIOs and CTOs and chief data officers. It wasn't a CISO conference, it was essentially a CIO conference. And it was of Fortune 100 CIOs, so heads of technology and people driving data and AI strategy for some of the largest organizations. And the sense from that audience was, while there's still a little bit of skepticism of some of the super hyped parts of AI, what they're feeling in the room was if anything, this technology and sets of technologies and what you can do with it is in fact underhyped based on their experience of how they're driving pilots and prototypes to production and how they're getting agentic deployments deployed even faster. But what was also interesting was they're keenly aware of many of the challenges we'll talk about, whether it's on AI and agentic identity, privileges, controls, and guardrails. But what's also different at this stage now is we're coming through realizing the limitations of certain types of AI technology, looking at how generative AI is augmented with symbolic and other traditional forms of AI, as well as symbolic AI, plus it being layered with guardrails and controls, means that the AI systems that many organizations are now deploying are a combination of technologies that make up for the deficiencies in some part of the technology and use other parts of the technology for its strengths. And so that in turn is driving this widespread adoption and this massive investment that this takes everything that we've done at this scale. I mean, it's at least as significant as the internet, cloud, and mobile transitions we've gone through, perhaps arguably even more significant when we look back. So, but some things never change in all of this technology adoption. And those of you who have kind of remember the internet revolution, the adoption of cloud, the adoption of mobile, this thing is exactly the same as that. Is we're in effect making everything up as we go along. Standards for control, for interoperability, for security, for testing, for validation, for identity, for privilege management. All of those things are emerging at the same time as the technology emerges. And while it's tempting to kind of be disappointed by that, I think that's the inevitable reality of every technology change. And again, in the prior waves of technology change, we saw exactly the same things. And so the most important thing, though, for all of us is to keep engaging on improving the controls and standards and innovating alongside our colleagues who are innovating the base technology to make sure we are able to protect and manage and control it. But fundamental issues are going to keep remaining. We're all familiar with the challenges of prompt injection and explainability and other aspects of the risks in the use of AI models and in their incarnation in agents. And some of these are fundamental challenges. For example, prompt injection comes from the challenge that the data plane and the control plane for AI are not as separate as we would like, that we've been trying to achieve in conventional programming and conventional systems. But there is work, things like Google's Camel project and various other work to look at how do you more fundamentally mitigate the risk of prompt injection. So again, innovation is happening. And in all of this, and this again is similar to the prior waves of technology change, it's always tempting to kind of overestimate what you think will happen in the short term and then get disappointed. But at the same time, we have a tendency as a society to underestimate the long-term effects of many of these potential changes. And then also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is we also underestimate the second-order risks. One of the things that we saw in internet, mobile, cloud was the risks we were concerned about at the time of implementation of that technology turned out to be not as big as the risks that came from what we then did with that technology. And so while we're focused correctly on making sure that the base controls of what we're deploying are sound, we should always keep an eye on what's going to come next in terms of how we use this technology and how it's going to change the risk landscape. So when we now look at attacker use of AI, and again, this is something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, there's a lot of great research out there from companies like Google and Anthropic and others researching how attackers both organized crime and nation state are making use of AI. It's the classic things like the use of AI for improving their ability to do social engineering, whether it's phishing, social engineering in terms of scams, committing fraud. There's a whole array of things that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But we also see attackers using it to develop exploits, to develop malware, to develop new means of obfuscating what they're doing, driving misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And then more worryingly, and again in the recent reports from Anthropic and Google in particular, it's showing the first signs where nation state and some organized criminal groups demonstrating more advanced use of AI to chain together reconnaissance, exploitation, and monetization and final exploitation of whole chains of vulnerabilities is something that we're actually starting to see. And I think that's the first indication of what the future looks like for attackers. But there is obviously much more promise for defenders, I think. And so while we're seeing that initial use of attacker use of AI, I think ultimately the structural advantages for defenders that have the context, the data, the means of architecting their environment to use AI provides a lot more promise for defenders in the long run. And this is everything from vulnerability discovery. And so we're seeing many cases of this today, whether it's, again, the work that Google has done on Big Sleep and nap time and some of those other systems, similar things from OpenAI and Anthropic and many other labs and companies. So AI is proving adept at finding vulnerabilities and recommending fixes. We're also seeing wide-scale use of AI around the generation of secure configurations. You see this in particularly from many of the cloud providers who are using AI augmentation to existing engineering processes to improve the ability to generate secure configurations. It's also in many cases, again, with mixture of experts models, proving quite useful at generating even more secure code, although there is still some debate in some of the base models whether they're capable of producing enough security in the code as we would expect. We're also seeing a lot of use of AI to profile threat actors, to research threat groups. Again, many of the surfacing and identification of many of these kind of North Korean actors that are becoming fake workers at organizations. Many of the security incident response and threat intelligence organizations have been able to quite successfully use AI to track and profile their activities to get somewhat predictive of where the next number of employees are going to be in those organizations. So again, use of AI for threat intelligence is prevalent. Probably many of you are more familiar with the use of AI in detection and response. It seems to be the first wave of real success in many organizations is around using AI for security operations and automating security operations in more effective ways. And as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of potential in not just generating secure code, but in augmenting the production of software as part of many developer activities using AI to boost their productivity, to also provide more intelligence about what types of frameworks and controls should be part of those AI-generated applications. And there's a lot of positive work happening there, including auto-remediation of certain classes of vulnerabilities, which is proving quite effective. And then also a big part of the use of AI in many organizations has been to improve the testing ability, the auto-generation of test and regression tests that speed the production and integration of fixes into the environment. So overall, I think defenders do have this potential structural advantage even more than attackers. But the obvious statement is that defenders need to actually make use of this and more aggressively drive it. Now, when you look at the security and control of AI adoption in the enterprise, so there's many kind of ways of looking at this. And again, all of you will be familiar with the hundreds of different attacks, the hundreds of different risks of controls around how you deploy AI, whether it's model poisoning, data poisoning, prompt injection. There's a whole catalog of potential risks. But fundamentally, when you take a step back, it really just comes down to these 5 main pillars that I'm seeing organizations who are most successful in the safe, controlled, and secure deployment of AI They focus on these 5 things, and all of the rest is kind of detail beneath this. So the first one is fundamentally we're dealing with a software lifecycle risk. So we have a bunch of technology, whether it's the underlying models, the actual inference technology, the software supply chain of all of the components that we adopt to deliver an AI-enabled system. This is very similar to all of the risks we've been focused on historically in all of our other software. And the same applies here, having a strong software supply chain, understanding the software inventory, keeping everything up to date, managing vulnerabilities, remediating and patching vulnerabilities. It's the same focus, but perhaps even requiring even more diligence on software lifecycle risks. Secondly, it's also a big data governance risk. So you have to make sure that the training data has integrity, the test data, the model weights and other parameters are significant areas to focus on. And very few organizations historically have had strong programs of data governance. And so many organizations that say, didn't have a chief data officer a few years ago are now finding that not just to enable the use of their data in more commercial ways, are finding they need those data governance programs to manage the risks of all of the data lineage that goes into the AI systems. And again, that's a tremendous control requirement for identity and access and data integrity and all the things that we've all been focused on around the identity and access management approach around data. And third, the organizations have to think about how do they manage and maintain the operational risks of deployment. So deploying an AI system requires extra checks and balances, whether it's guardrails that regulate what the AI can do, or in particular an agentic deployment can do, how the input and output of the models are filtered and protected, even to the extent that deploying circuit breakers, where if an agent is detected as straying away from its required parameters or the expected behavior, that there's an ability of a surrounding control guardrail to stop that activity. And ultimately, many organizations now are driving quite heavily to say, okay, I'm not just required to control the software and the data that drives my agents, but also equip those agents with the right permissions, but then not necessarily just trust the agent to continue to behave, but to deploy controls in the environment that act as a second set of controls that limit what the agents can possibly do. And this is where identity and access and everything that we're all focused on in NHIcon is paramount. So think about what's the model by which you equip an agent with an identity. When is it appropriate to have a delegated identity, a delegated set of permissions from whoever instigates the action of an agent? When is it appropriate for an agent to have its own unique identity, whether it should have an ephemeral set of identities and privileges that are appropriate to just its individual tasking at one particular time? So I think we're all learning what does it mean in the patterns of deployments of agents. How does that match the types of privilege, identity, and the dynamic nature of how you increase and decrease the privileges allocated to agents? And then how do you monitor those versus the environment? And then, as I mentioned, with the guardrails that are required, how do you then also apply privileges and permissions to the MCP gateways, the API gateways, all of the other different protocols, whether it's A2A or AP2, and how do you apply privilege in that context so you can take a step back and really understand the collected set of privileges to actions that a fleet of agents in your organization may be capable of operating to, and does that fit within what you expect? And then finally, that also plays to the importance of testing and validation. And this is not just the testing and validation of a particular system at the implementation time. One of the things that we also see in many AI systems is the potential drift in behavior over time, the potential drift in how it operates, the potential non-linear activities that come from exposing it to different types of data. And so it's important, even more than our conventional systems, to continuously test and validate over time on a more continuous basis. And that includes looking at whether the permissions, identities, and the inter-agent communications and permissions of that with the back-end resources continue to be appropriate. And so we're going to have to keep taking a much more expansive view of testing and validation. Now, I mentioned before the notion of second order risks. And so again, in all of our previous waves of technology, for example, in mobile technology, so when mobile first came to much increased prominence with iOS and with Android back in the late 2000s, a lot of the focus on the risks were on the devices, the software. But when you think about the second order effects that came from that mobile revolution, you have all sorts of the things that we started to do with mobile devices that enabled new and different business models, new and different activities that themselves carried actually more significant risk than the first waves of the risks that we contended with the devices. And I think the same thing is going to happen, and we're already seeing this play out in AI is, so what are the risks that come from this deployed technology? So the first example there on what you might call mediated understanding, you see this today, and I'll give like one example. You see a law firm, for example, that takes the 5 requirements for a contract and inputs it to a legal AI, which generates a large contract document that gets sent to the other person's lawyers, who then use an AI to say, what is this contract committing me to? And they come up with a list of things. Like, the question is the list of what you intended and the list of what is interpreted the same thing? And does the actual contract generated and mediated and understood by the AI actually reflect what everybody's agreeing to? And that's just like one example of where, in a world where we're all intermediated by AIs, are we really sure of what those things are committing us to and they're actually doing? And do the traces and transactions and trajectories and effects of all of these AI systems, when we capture those, do they correspond to our intent? And so there's a lot of work still to be done. We've also got to pay more attention to the risks of de-skilling. So one of the things, the research is quite conclusive on this, that the people who benefit the most from AI are people who are already experts in a particular area. While AI does also democratize things, like it's a lot easier for more people to generate software, it's also even more exponentially productive for very experienced software engineers to use AI. So the big question for all of us in all industries is, how do we get that gap from novice to expert that used to be fulfilled by people doing the work and becoming more expert and attuned and building judgment? Are we still going to have the ability to cross that gap from novice to expert when everybody's equipped with AI? And again, you see some organizations thinking ahead of that and thinking about the use of AI that improves productivity, but also imparts the ability to help people as they get more expert over time. And again, that's just something we have to think about to protect the ability of our teams to continue to be effective even when using AI. We're also going to see, in a world of billions, if not trillions, of agents that are coming and interacting with each other, what does it mean for the emergent behaviors to come from there? And do we really understand how all of those agents are interacting with each other? It's a bit like the difference between kind of ants and anthills. When you get enough agents interacting, are they going to exhibit emergent intelligence as opposed to just the individual intelligence of the model? And again, we don't think we have the ability yet as a society to really think about, how do we control all these agents? I mean, so that the other example, if you look back at electronic trading in financial markets, when you have things like flash crashes and other types of behaviors, imagine a world in a few months, a few quarters, a few years. Are we going to have agentic flash crashes where collections of agents start behaving in ways that we didn't expect, that their individual training doesn't dictate? Again, this is a world that we're going to have to contend with. And similarly, all of these agents are interacting with back-end services through APIs, through gateways, through an array of different protocols that are constantly being released and innovated. And I think a lot of the industry is still to figure out, what is that going to mean to the guardrails of APIs, the service level management, the performance management, the layers of infrastructure that intermediates agents and back-end services? A lot of work still to be done there. And even now into the more esoteric risks, a world of augmented reality where we have individual overlays of voice, video, image, and we're using AI agents to assist our interpretation of the world. Are we sure that we can defend those agents to not be manipulated to present us as individuals with a different view of reality than is the actual true picture of reality. Again, these are things that security teams are going to have to deal with after we've got through the basic level of risks and controls. And then finally, we also have to think about what does it mean to think about multi-party control. So many of our processes in our organizations, whether it's approving changes to our finance books and records, where you have one person creates a transaction, another person approves a transaction, or even code reviews and code changes where you have two people reviewing and approving things. What does it mean in those environments to have a human approver or reviewer of an AI action, or two AIs interacting to have the independent approval process for a particular business flow? What does it mean for a human to approve an AI action or an AI to approve a human action? Well, again, the industry is still figuring these things out according to each domain-specific risk. And ultimately, we're going to have to come up with these business level controls and standards to determine that. Now, just wrapping up before we kind of get to spend some time on questions, just want to kind of think about the next 6 to 24 months. So just really, I think there's kind of four things we're going to have to really contend with in addition to all of what we've talked about in terms of implementing controls and standards. The first is, I think we're going to see this tidal wave of vulnerabilities coming at us. We're going to be generating more software in a world where we can find more vulnerabilities in software, both attackers and defenders, as in vulnerability researchers. So we're going to put strain on our existing strained vulnerability management systems because of an increased amount of software that has a higher density of vulnerabilities, with more vulnerabilities of that being discovered. So this is something that we are all going to have to be prepared for. The second backdrop against that even magnifies that concern is attackers are industrializing. As we talked about earlier, attackers are using AI to magnify their productivity. I think arguably the dirty secret of the cybersecurity world is that there are more vulnerabilities that are unexploited than exploited. And the reason for that is attackers are resource constrained. They have bosses and budgets just like the rest of us. Now, when you think about the use of AI, as we do in most of our businesses, if AI is used by attackers to increase their productivity so they can not only find but exploit and monetize more vulnerabilities against this backdrop of there being more vulnerabilities, then we could be in for a pretty wild ride over the next few quarters and years, while we adopt the technology as defenders to mitigate some of these risks. We're also seeing this initial drive now for what you might call a quest for authenticity. So AI is driving this fake workers, fake content, fake brands, fake companies. And this is something, when you step back and you look across all of our business processes, our identity and access processes, our support processes, our supply chain interactions, the ability of determining whether the person we interviewed is genuine, and does that person have the claimed skills, and is that the person that actually turns up and works in our organization on a regular basis? These are all questions that have become more challenging than ever before. And so what I think we're going to keep seeing is lots of need for innovation in both companies, existing and new companies, that are around this theme of just driving a desire to really understand if something is authentic or not. And I think that's going to change the character of many of our cybersecurity processes. And then finally, as I mentioned on several of the slides, one of the things that ultimately is we can't just control and manage the risks of agentic AI in particular by focusing on the agents themselves. That's something we have to do. We have to make sure they're validated, the permissions and identities are correct. But ultimately, we need an enterprise agentic control plane where we can assert what the collective behavior and permissions of the agents versus internal resources should be, not just micromanaging those at the agent or the gateway or the server level, but thinking about this as an overall enterprise control plane. And I think fundamentally, as organizations try and take advantage of all of this, then that fundamentally becomes the real challenge for innovation, is how to deliver this technology while delivering it within the context of an enterprise control plane. So against this backdrop, I'll just close by saying that I'm probably pretty short-term pessimistic. I think all of these changes, all of these innovations for attackers are going to contribute to a lot of pain over the next quarters, probably even more so than we've experienced recently. But at the same time, I'm very long-term optimistic because I think ultimately this technology structurally benefits defenders more than it will attackers for a whole variety of reasons of data and context. I think it just requires defenders to aggressively adopt this to make sure we can, as we should, outpace attackers. So let me stop there. I'm happy to take as many questions come in. Yep.
Phil, that was fantastic, and not surprisingly, a lot of questions did come in. If we don't get to them, we only have a few minutes. Phil will hang around and directly answer those in the Q&A. Phil, the second order risk slide was interesting. It's where things really get a little harder to predict, right? We had a question about which one worries you the most from an enterprise standpoint. The question was kind of geared around junior roles becoming obsolete in enterprises.
Yeah, so the thing that worries me the most is this a world in 2 years where there's literally trillions of agents acting on our behalf, interacting on the behalf of customers with our organizations, interacting with each other. Just what does it mean to control, manage, and observe whether that's behaving in the right way? I don't think there's any solid research on how to think about that. The reason it worries me is the thing that we know for sure in complex systems of multiple independent agents in the classic sense, not in the current AI sense. Whenever you get such an environment, you get surprising emergent behaviors that are not necessarily all good behaviors. And that's something I think we have to pay attention to. And again, identity and privilege and how you think about that and how you think about that control plane does play out. And I think on the skills issue, it's an open question. I know some organizations where they're automating away entry-level positions are being proactive in still bringing on entry-level people to train them. Otherwise, they're going to get a block in their future expert pipeline. But I think there's not a real solid accepted way of dealing with that dichotomy that we may be automating away entry-level positions, but at the same time, we need to take people at entry level through to expert in the same way we always did, despite increasing AI automation. And that's a challenge for many organizations.
Yeah. Less than 2 minutes left here, so keep it tight. But this is a defender question. Do you think another use of AI is deception to thwart the attacker and increasing the change rate of perceived attack surfaces?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. It's in fact something I've been looking at a lot recently. Is deception technology has been around for a long time. Honeypots, honey traps, tar pits, all of these things that can confuse attackers. Historically, it's not been that widely deployed and not been that successful. I think now we're probably going to see a renaissance of deception technology, particularly because it seems like it's more effective in confusing AI-driven attacks. Whether that's a temporary thing or a permanent thing is an open question, but I certainly see there's a lot more opportunity for deception technology, and so I think there's a dust off those honeypots and tar pits and get them deployed again.
Right. All right, we have 30 seconds to answer this one. Are enterprises going to be comfortable with autonomous agents without a human in the middle to authorize the agents?
I think, yes. I think some of those, there is actions today where that's happening. I think, though, organizations are going to have to figure out what are the critical business processes and critical activities for which they're going to continue to need a human in the loop. I think the bigger question is, how can they make sure that that human in the loop is an effective oversight as opposed to just a clicking of the box of what the machine has done? And that's probably the bigger question.
All right, Phil Venables, you're so good at this. We could talk for many more minutes, but thank you for joining us today. I want to tell everyone to please visit the sponsor booth to win prizes. Phil, thank you, and a reminder to join our next sessions, which are beginning now.